On the 16th of June, 1943, a courthouse in Carpinteria, California, processed a marriage license for a bride who had turned 18 exactly 1 month earlier. The groom was 54. 2 witnesses stood in the room, a studio secretary and a photographer, the latter there specifically to sell the pictures. The bride's father was not present. He was not even told the wedding was happening until he read about it in the newspaper. And when he did, he made a decision that would define the rest of both of their lives. He picked up no telephone. He wrote no letter. He simply stopped being her father. Her name was Oona O'Neill. Her father was Eugene O'Neill, the only American playwright ever to win the Nobel Prize in literature. A man whose entire body of work was an unflinching excavation of what families do to each other. He knew better than almost anyone alive what a broken family looked like from the inside, because he had grown up in one and had spent 4 Pulitzer Prizes writing about it. When the moment came to find out whether he had learned anything from his own plays, he disowned his daughter and never spoke to her again, as long as he lived. These facts sound like a metaphor, pushed too far. They are not. Charlie Chaplin, the man Oona O'Neill married that afternoon, was 54 years old. Eugene O'Neill was 54 years old. The 2 men had been born 6 months apart. A playwright who had spent his career writing about fathers who could not forgive and children who could not escape, looked at his own daughter marrying a man his own age and became, without any apparent irony, the villain of the next chapter in the same story he had already written 4 times over. That is not even the strangest part of the O'Neill family. Eugene O'Neill had 3 children by 3 different marriages, and 2 of his sons died by suicide in the same year, 27 years apart in age, but joined by the same inheritance of addiction and abandonment running through the family like a fault line. His daughter Oona seemed, for a while, to be the one who got out, the one who married into one of the most famous households on earth, and escaped whatever it was that was destroying her brothers. Then, within the same 12 months, she buried one of those brothers and her husband on opposite sides of an ocean she had crossed, specifically to get away from where all of this started. I have spent a long time trying to understand how a man could describe, with total clarity, the exact mechanism by which a family destroys itself, and then operate that mechanism on his own children without appearing to recognize what he was doing. The comfortable explanation is that writers are better at understanding lives than living them. That is probably true, but it is not the whole story here, because the pattern did not end with Eugene. It moved through his children like something inherited, showing up in different disguises, addiction in one, addiction and neglect in another, and, in the third, a marriage that looked like a rescue and turned out to be its own kind of exile. This is Oona O'Neill's story, but it only makes sense once you understand her father's, because everything that happened to her, the wedding that ended a relationship instead of starting one, the exile, the 2 brothers she outlived and then lost within months of each other, the father, who never once picked up a telephone, began in a house that was already broken before she was born. Chapter 1. The House That Wrote Itself. Eugene O'Neill was born in a hotel room in New York City on the 16th of October, 1888. He would die in a hotel room too, 65 years later, and his last coherent words were reportedly a joke about it, that he had been born in a hotel room and would be damned if he didn't die in one. Between those 2 hotel rooms was a childhood that he spent the rest of his life turning into plays, and a family that supplied him with more material than any writer should ever be handed. His father, James O'Neill, had come to America from Kilkenny Island as a small child, into a poverty so severe that the family was evicted from their tenement, while James's own father was dying inside it. James went to work as a boy and never fully stopped being afraid of ending up back where he started. He became an actor, a good one, and by the 1880s, he had made himself famous, playing a single role, the Count of Monte Cristo. In a melodrama, he performed more than 6,000 times over 3 decades because it was reliably profitable and he could not bring himself to walk away from the money. He knew, and said so, that the role had made him rich and killed him as an artist. He kept playing it anyway. The fear of poverty that had been beaten into him as a child in Ohio never left, and it shaped every financial decision he made for the rest of his life, including some that would badly damage the people who depended on him. His mother, Mary Ellen Quinlan, called Ella, had been convent-educated, gifted at the piano, and dreamed as a young woman of becoming a concert pianist, or possibly a nun. She married James O'Neill instead, and spent the following years on the road with his touring company, living out of hotel rooms, in a life that had none of the stability her convent upbringing had trained her to expect. In 1888, giving birth to her third son in a hotel room, she was attended by a cheap doctor James had hired to save money. The doctor prescribed her morphine for the pain. She did not stop taking it for the next 25 years. Her son Eugene did not learn the truth about his mother's addiction until he was a teenager, catching her in the act, and the discovery became one of the defining wounds of his life, one he would eventually turn into the single most devastating scene in American theatre. The family did not have a home so much as a rotation of hotel rooms and a summer cottage in New London, Connecticut, where they returned each year and where Eugene came to feel the closest thing to rootedness he would ever have. He was sent away to Catholic boarding schools for most of his childhood, first at 7 years old, and he later said that the sense of having been given away stayed with him permanently. His older brother, James Jr., called Jamie, had wanted to be an actor, like his father, and lacked the discipline or the talent to become one. He drank instead, steadily, and then catastrophically, cycling through Broadway chorus girls and bars, while his parents alternately supported and despaired of him. A middle brother, Edmund, died of measles in infancy, after Jamie, in a moment of childish jealousy, deliberately exposed the baby to the illness. Eugene was born 18 months after Edmund's death, a replacement child in a family that had already lost one son to sibling cruelty and was quietly losing another to alcohol in slow motion. Eugene followed the family pattern with real fidelity. He drank through a single unhappy year at Princeton before leaving, by most accounts, for a combination of poor attendance and a prank involving a beer bottle thrown through a professor's window. He drifted through his 20s, working briefly as a gold prospector in Honduras, where he found no gold and contracted malaria instead. At 23, living in a rooming house on Fulton Street in Manhattan and drinking through most of his waking hours, he swallowed a bottle of the barbiturate veronal. He survived only because a group of drinking companions broke into his room in time. He would later say almost nothing about the attempt directly, but its shadow runs through nearly everything he wrote afterward. Within 3 years of each other, both of his parents and his brother Jamie were dead. Ella died in 1922, having finally broken free of her morphine addiction only a few years earlier. James had died the year before. Jamie, who had never gotten free of anything, drank himself into what Eugene later called a life, wasted and ruined, and died in 1923, still only in his 40s. Eugene O'Neill was 35 years old, and every member of the household that had raised him was gone. What he did with what remained, the guilt, the material, the exact geometry of a family destroying itself in slow motion, was write it down, obsessively, for the next 3 decades. He would not finish the most honest version of that story, a play called Long Day's Journey into Night, until near the end of his life. And he would leave instructions that it not be published until 25 years after his death, because he did not want the people still living to have to read it while they could still be hurt by it. It was, in its way, the only act of protection he ever managed toward his family. By then he had children of his own, and the pattern he had spent his whole career diagnosing was already well underway in the next generation. Chapter 2. 3 marriages, 3 kinds of absence. Eugene O'Neill married 3 times, and each marriage produced a child, and in each case, the marriage ended in a way that left the child effectively fatherless, while the father was still alive. He was not, by most accounts, a man who set out to abandon his children. He was a man who found fatherhood difficult to be present for, even when he was trying, and who found it very easy to leave when a marriage stopped working. And the 2 facts together meant that none of his 3 children got much of him at all. His first marriage was to Kathleen Jenkins in 1909, when he was 20 and she was pregnant. His own mother pressed for an annulment. It did not happen. and Eugene Gladstone, O'Neill Jr., was born the following May. By his own later account, Eugene Jr. did not meet his father for the first time until he was around 11 or 12 years old. His parents had separated almost immediately, Eugene having taken a prospecting trip to Central America, partly, by most tellings, to get away from the marriage and the impending responsibility of it. And the divorce was finalized in 1912 when the boy was 2. For the next decade, Eugene Jr. grew up as a rumor of a father, a famous name, attached to a man he had never seen. The second marriage was to Agnes Bolton, a writer he met in 1917 and married the following year. This one lasted longer and produced 2 children, a son named Shane in 1919 and a daughter named Oona in 1925. For a period, this looked like it might be the version of the family that held together. They lived at Peaktail Bar on Cape Cod and later at a Bermuda estate called Spithead, and Eugene, for a time, made real efforts at fatherhood that his own upbringing had given him almost no model for. It did not last. By 1926, he had begun an affair with the actress Carlotta Monterey, and by 1927, he had effectively left the household, informing his young son Shane by letter that he would not see him again for some time. Oona was 2 years old. The divorce was finalized in 1929, and Agnes was left to raise both children, largely alone, first at Spithead, and then, once Oona was school age, in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. Oona would later say she saw her father only rarely after the separation, and each visit came to feel more like an audience with a stranger than a relationship with a parent. The third marriage, to Carlotta Monterey in 1929, was the one that lasted. Carlotta was a former actress, striking, controlling, and fiercely protective of Eugene's time and health, in a way that some who knew the family read as devotion, and others read as a campaign to wall him off from everyone who had known him before her. She managed his household, his correspondence, and increasingly his relationships with his own children, and by most accounts she had little patience for the demands, financial or emotional, of 3 young people from 2 earlier marriages. Eugene's letters to his children grew sparser through the 1930s. Visits grew rarer still. When he eventually rewrote his will, Carlotta was named sole beneficiary, and his children from his first 2 marriages were left out of it almost entirely. What this produced, by the early 1940s, was 3 young adults who shared a famous surname and almost nothing else, Eugene Jr. Had grown up mostly without his father, and had spent his adult life trying, through academic achievement, to earn a relationship that never fully arrived. Shane had gotten the letter as a small boy and grown up, defined by its absence. Oona had gotten a handful of stilted visits, and a stepmother who did not want her around, and by the time she was a teenager in New York, she had stopped expecting anything different. Each of them would spend the next 15 years working out, in strikingly different ways, what to do with a father who had written more honestly about paternal failure than any other writer of his century, and had somehow still managed to fail at it in exactly the ways he described. Chapter 3. The son who looked like he'd escaped. If you had been asked, at any point before 1950, which of Eugene O'Neill's 3 children had turned out best, the obvious answer was the one he barely knew, Eugene O'Neill Jr. Entered Yale in 1928 and, in his freshman year, published a poem that was reprinted widely enough to get his name in the papers on its own merits rather than his father's. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1932, was tapped for the Skull and Bones Society, studied for a year in Germany, and returned to earn a PhD in classics from Yale in 1936. He became a professor of Greek literature, taught at Yale itself, then Princeton, then Fordham, then Sarah Lawrence, edited a scholarly collection of Greek plays, wrote book reviews for the New York Times and the Saturday Review, and became, by the standards of classical scholarship, something close to a minor celebrity, appearing as a regular voice on the CBS radio program Invitation to Learning. He had done, on paper, exactly what a son with almost no father was supposed to do. He had built a life entirely out of his own effort, in a field his father had no part of, and made himself into someone worth knowing on his own terms. Underneath the credentials, the pattern that had taken his Uncle Jamie, and would eventually take his father's whole family, was already at work. He married in 1931 to a woman named Elizabeth Green, and the marriage lasted 6 years before ending in divorce. Within a month of that divorce becoming final, he married again to Janet Hunter Longley, the daughter of a Yale mathematics professor. That marriage lasted barely a year. In the summer of 1939, he married a third time to Sally Hayward, and this marriage held together for 5 years, long enough that the couple visited Eugene and Carlotta at their California home, Tow House, and it might have looked from a distance like the version of his life that was finally working. In April of 1944, Sally left him and moved to New York. He followed her there that fall, alone. He spent the next 4 years teaching where he could find a position, at Princeton briefly, then Fairleigh Dickinson, moving through faculty appointments the way his father had once moved through hotel rooms. In the summer of 1948, he relocated to Woodstock, New York, with a woman named Ruth Reed Lander, and it was there, according to people who knew him in that period, that the drinking that had been a background feature of his adult life became the foreground of it. Colleagues and friends described a man growing harder to reach, more erratic, more isolated, retreating into alcohol with the same steady, unhurried inevitability that had taken his Uncle Jamie a generation earlier and would take his half-brother Shane a generation after him. On the 25th of September, 1950, Eugene O'Neill Jr. was found dead in his home in Woodstock. He had cut his left wrist and ankle. He was 40 years old. He left no children. His father, from whom he had spent most of his childhood estranged, and much of his adulthood only intermittently in contact, was informed of the death, but did not attend the funeral. Some accounts describe Eugene Sr. as devastated by the news in private, unable to speak of it for days. Whatever grief he felt, he did not translate it into any visible change in how he treated his 2 remaining children, both of whom were, by 1950, already living lives that would eventually intersect with tragedies of their own. What makes Eugene Jr.'s death particularly hard to file neatly into the family pattern is that he had done everything right by the metrics available to him. He had not repeated his father's flight from responsibility or his uncle's total collapse into drink. He had built, from a childhood with almost no paternal presence at all, an entire respectable identity as a scholar and a public intellectual. It did not save him. Whatever had been passed down through the O'Neill family, whether it was a chemical predisposition toward alcoholism or a psychological inheritance of abandonment, repeating itself in each generation's own vocabulary, achievement turned out to be no defense against it. He was the first of Eugene O'Neill's 3 children to die. His father would follow him within 3 years, still unreconciled with his surviving daughter and largely a stranger to his surviving son. And his younger half-brother, who had spent his own adult life demonstrating an entirely different way of losing the same inheritance, would follow him 27 years later, in the same year that claimed the one person who had genuinely made Oona's escape look like it had worked. Chapter 4. The Son Who Never Had a Chance. When Shane O'Neill was born on the 30th of October, 1919, the doctor who delivered him later recalled that his father was out getting drunk somewhere else at the time. It is the kind of detail that could be dismissed as an unfair anecdote if it did not turn out to describe, with almost total accuracy, the shape of the relationship that followed. As Shane grew up, family friends described his father as visibly detached from him, present in the house, but not really present in the boy's life. And when Eugene finally left Agnes Boulton for Carlotta Monterey in 1927, he told his 8-year-old son by letter that he would not be seeing him again for a long time. Shane spent the rest of his childhood waiting for a version of a long time that never fully ended. He was sent to military school in Florida, and it was there, as a teenager, that he began drinking heavily, following the family pattern with the kind of grim exactness that suggests he had absorbed something about what O'Neill men were supposed to do with their pain. In 1941, he joined the Merchant Marine and saw combat in the Atlantic during some of the worst years of the war for Allied shipping. In 1943, he was hospitalized for what was almost certainly what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress. He attempted suicide at least twice in this period, years before the attempt that would eventually succeed. In 1944, he married, and the following period brought a tragedy severe enough to end the little relationship he still had with his father entirely. He and his wife had a son named Eugene III, after his grandfather, who died at 2 months old, with a doctor's report noting evidence of neglect in the household. Eugene O'Neill, informed of his infant grandson's death, was appalled, and by most accounts, he never again had any real contact with Shane afterward. It was the final closing of a door that had already been mostly shut for 17 years. Shane and his wife went on to have 4 more children, and Shane was arrested for heroin possession in 1948, and again in 1962, the addiction settling into his life with the same permanence that morphine had once settled into his grandmother's. Later in his life, Shane and his family moved into Spithead, the Bermuda estate his father had once shared with Agnes Boulton, and where Shane himself had spent part of his childhood. He supported the household, by the accounts of people who knew him, by selling off the furniture, piece by piece, as the money ran out, living inside the physical remains of a family that had already emotionally dissolved decades earlier. With a collaborator, he wrote a book about the O'Neills that he called The Curse of the Misbegotten, a title that reads less like a marketing choice than like a diagnosis he had made about his own life and was no longer trying to argue with. On the 22nd of June, 1977, Shane O'Neill jumped from the 4th floor of an apartment building. He was 57 years old. He was buried in Connecticut under his full name, Shane Rudraig O'Neill, the middle name an old Irish one his father had chosen, one of the only things Eugene had given him that Shane kept using for the rest of his life. His death came 5 months before another death that would land on his sister with almost unbearable proximity, in the same calendar year, an ocean away, closing out a 12-month span in which Oona O'Neill would lose both her brother and the man she had married 34 years earlier, specifically, in part, to get away from a father who could not love his children without conditions none of them had been able to meet. Spithead itself eventually passed to Oona, the family home her brother had stripped of its furniture to survive, now hers to keep or sell or simply hold. The last physical thing, connecting 3 children who had spent their entire adult lives trying, in 3 completely different directions, to get as far from it as they could. Chapter 5. The girl everyone wanted to know, while her half-brother, Eugene Jr, was collecting academic honours he could never quite trade for his father's attention, and her brother Shane was being quietly erased from the family by a letter he received at 8 years old. Oona O'Neill was growing up in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, raised almost entirely by her mother, seeing her father so rarely that each visit felt, in her own later description, less like time with a parent than an audience granted by a stranger. What she had, that her brothers largely did not, was proximity to New York, a mother who kept her socially connected despite the divorce, and an ease in a room that neither of her brothers' academic credentials or military service had given them. She attended the Brearley School, a private girls' school on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and there she became close friends with 2 other daughters of famous, complicated families. Gloria Vanderbilt, heir to a fortune and a custody scandal that had made headlines when she was a small child, and Carol Marcus, who would later marry the writer William Saroyan twice, and then the actor Walter Matthau. By 1940 and 1941, the 3 of them were regular fixtures at the Stork Club, photographed at a level of nightclub visibility that most girls their age would not experience at any point in their lives, let alone while still enrolled in secondary school. It was in this world, in the summer of 1941, that Oona met a 22-year-old aspiring writer named Jerome David Salinger. He fell for her, immediately and completely. When he was drafted and sent south for training after Pearl Harbor, he wrote her letters that ran 10 and 15 pages long, letters Carol Marcus later described, through Truman Capote's own account of the period, as something closer to love letter essays than correspondence. Salinger was, by every surviving account, extraordinarily serious about Oona, in a way she was not prepared to reciprocate with equal weight. As his deployment stretched on, and his letters kept arriving, her attention had already begun moving elsewhere, toward Hollywood, and toward a man who could offer her something. Salinger, at that point, an unpublished 20-something, with no money and an uncertain future, simply could not. The kind of transformation that made her the most talked about young woman in the country, rather than merely one of its most eligible debutantes. In 1942, the Stork Club named her the #1 debutante of the season, a title that came with the kind of press coverage most actresses would have needed a produced film to earn. Around the same time, she made her decision. She had grown up the granddaughter of a famous stage actor, James O'Neill, and the daughter of a Nobel Laureate, and pursuing acting herself felt to her, by her own account, like the obvious next step rather than a rebellion. She took small parts in 2-stage productions in New York, then left for Hollywood in 1942, 17 years old, with a plan that had nothing to do with any of the men currently writing her letters or courting her attention. In Hollywood, she was introduced, through her agent, to Charlie Chaplin, who was considering her for a role in a project he was developing. The role never materialized. What developed instead, over the following months, was a relationship that moved with a speed and intensity that alarmed nearly everyone who knew both of them. Salinger, still overseas, still writing, had no idea any of this was happening until it was already public. When he finally learned that Oona had married Chaplin, he was, by every account from people close to him, devastated in a way that outlasted the relationship itself by years. He sent her a series of bitter letters afterward. He would go on, over the following decades, to build a career and a private mythology, partly out of young women he idealized, and then felt betrayed by. And more than one biographer has pointed to that summer of 1941 and the silence that followed it as the place where the pattern started. None of that mattered to Oona at the time. She was 18 years old. She had found a man twice her age who seemed to offer exactly the kind of stability, protection, and singular devotion that her own father had never given her. And on the 16th of June, 1943, she married him in a courthouse in Carpinteria, with 2 witnesses and a photographer, and no father anywhere in the room. Chapter 6. The Wedding. Charlie Chaplin was, on paper, an unlikely rescue. At 54, he had already been through 3 marriages, all of them to women, roughly half his age, all of them ending badly. He had 2 teenage sons, Charles Jr. and Sydney, one of them Oona's own age, the other a year younger, a detail that meant Oona was on the verge of becoming a stepmother to boys she could plausibly have gone to school with. His career was, at that exact moment, in genuine trouble. He had drawn unfavourable headlines for his romantic history and for his public sympathy toward the Soviet Union during the war. And just 2 weeks before he married Oona, a young actress named Joan Barry filed a paternity suit against him, claiming he had fathered her child. A blood test would eventually clear him of the claim, but blood tests take time, and in June of 1943, the suit was still an open scandal, hanging over the wedding before it had even happened. None of it slowed anything down. On the 16th of June, 1943, a month after Oona turned 18, she and Chaplin drove to Carpinteria, a small town north of Los Angeles, and were married in a brief civil ceremony. The only witnesses were Chaplin's studio secretary, Catherine Hunter, and his friend and assistant, Harry Crocker. Crocker photographed the event himself, on Chaplin's instructions, because Chaplin had already made a calculated decision about how the story would be told. He gave exclusive rights to the photographs and the announcement to the gossip columnist Luella Parsons, hoping her coverage would be kinder than that of her rival, Hedda Hopper, who had made no secret of disliking him. Even the wedding, in other words, was managed as a piece of publicity before it was anything else, handled with the same instinct for controlling a narrative that had built his entire career. Agnes Boulton, Oona's mother, gave the marriage her blessing. She may have been the only member of the family who did. The union, and the 36-year age gap at the center of it, produced exactly the kind of media firestorm that a paternity suit and a 54-year-old groom guaranteed. And somewhere in the middle of that firestorm, Eugene O'Neill read the news like everyone else, in the papers, after the fact. He did not call, he did not write. He disowned his daughter outright. and according to family accounts, he extended the disownment to include her future children as well, refusing in advance any relationship with grandchildren who did not yet exist. It was not a temporary rupture of the kind that families sometimes recover from after a period of anger cools. Eugene O'Neill refused every subsequent attempt at reconciliation for the rest of his life, and there would be several, made by people close to both of them, over the following decade, all of which failed. There is a reading of this moment that treats it as almost too neat. A Nobel Laureate, who had spent his career diagnosing exactly this kind of generational repetition, watching his own daughter marry a man his own age, and responding with precisely the rigid, unforgiving withdrawal he had spent 40 years writing as tragedy. It is worth resisting the temptation to flatten it into pure irony, because from Eugene O'Neill's side, the reaction likely had less to do with literary self-awareness than with something closer to disgust, and, perhaps, an old man's discomfort at seeing his own mortality reflected back at him in his daughter's choice of husband. Whatever the precise mixture of motives, the effect on Oona was the same either way. She had married a man who could offer her the singular, undivided attention her father never had, and in doing so, she had guaranteed that her father would never offer her anything again. She was 18 years old, married to one of the most famous and most controversial men on earth, cut off completely from the family she had grown up in, and about to discover that Chaplin's fame came with a level of scrutiny, political danger, and eventual exile that neither of them fully anticipated on the day they drove up to Carpinteria. The wedding that was supposed to be her escape from one kind of instability was, within a decade, going to deliver her into another. Chapter 7. Exile. The first decade of the marriage looked, from the outside, like exactly the fairy tale the newspapers had been too cynical to predict. Oona gave up any remaining interest in an acting career of her own, almost immediately, and devoted herself instead to Chaplin's household and his children, both the two sons from his earlier marriages, and the four the couple had together in quick succession. Geraldine, in 1944, Michael, in 1946, Josephine, in 1949, and Victoria, in 1951. Chaplin, notoriously difficult and controlling, with almost everyone else in his professional life, was by every account genuinely happy with Oona in a way that surprised people who had watched his 3 previous marriages collapse. He would later say, she was the only unqualified good fortune of his life. Whatever skepticism greeted the marriage in June of 1943 had mostly evaporated by the early 1950s, replaced by something closer to a settled, if unconventional, domestic life in Beverly Hills. Then the government intervened. Chaplin had never become a naturalized American citizen, despite living in the United States for nearly 40 years, and his politics, his outspoken sympathy for the Soviet Union during the war, his refusal to publicly denounce communism as the Cold War hardened around him, had made him a target of federal suspicion for years. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had maintained a file on him since the 1920s. In September of 1952, Chaplin, Oona, and their 4 young children boarded a ship for England, where Chaplin planned to attend the London premiere of his new film, Limelight. While they were at sea, the United States Attorney General revoked Chaplin's re-entry permit, informing him that if he wished to return to the country he had lived and worked in for decades, he would first need to submit to an interview about his political sympathies and his personal conduct, a reference, thinly veiled, to both his suspected communist leanings and the Joan Barry scandal nearly a decade earlier. Chaplin refused. He and Oona decided, somewhere on that transatlantic crossing, that they would not go back. They settled in Switzerland, in an estate above Lake Geneva near the village of Coursier-sur-Vevey, and the remainder of both of their lives unfolded there. 4 more children followed. Eugene, born in 1953, and named, with what reads today like a small act of quiet defiance, after the father who had never spoken to Oona again. Then Jane in 1957, Annette in 1959, and Christopher in 1962. Oona, who had once been one of the most photographed young women in New York, spent the following decades running a household of 8 children on a Swiss estate, almost entirely out of the American press she had grown up inside of. In 1954, she made the decision final in the most literal way available to her. She renounced her United States citizenship and became a British subject, aligning her legal nationality with her husband's, rather than with the country that had, twice now, made her family's life untenable, first through her own father's rejection, and now through her adopted country's political persecution of the man she had married to get away from him. She would not set foot in the United States again for 2 decades, and when she and Chaplin finally did return, briefly, in 1972, it was for a ceremonial occasion, an honorary Academy Award, a symbolic reconciliation with an industry and a country that had exiled her husband 20 years earlier and never formally apologized for it. By every account from people who knew the household in Switzerland, Oona did not experience any of this as martyrdom. She managed Chaplin's correspondence, his business affairs, and eventually, much of his professional decision-making as he aged, becoming, in practice, something closer to a full partner in his career than the young ingenue the newspapers had described in 1943. She had traded one kind of visibility, the cafe society of Manhattan, for another, the quiet, total responsibility of holding together the household of one of the most famous and most politically embattled men in the world, an exile she had not chosen but adapted to completely. What she could not control from Switzerland was what had happened only months into that exile, back in the country and the family she had left behind. While she was still settling into a new life on Lake Geneva, her father, still unreconciled, was dying in a hotel room in Boston. Chapter 8, 1953. Eugene O'Neill spent his last years unable to write at all. The tremor in his hands, initially diagnosed as Parkinson's disease and only much later identified as a rare condition called cerebellar cortical atrophy, had grown severe enough by the mid-1940s that he could no longer hold a pencil steady, a particular cruelty for a man whose entire identity had been built on the physical act of putting sentences on paper. He and Carlotta moved into Suite 401 of the Shelton Hotel in Boston in 1951, chosen partly because Carlotta's psychiatrist kept an office nearby. He rarely left the room. He saw almost no one outside his doctor and his wife. He died there on the 27th of November, 1953, of pneumonia at the age of 65. In his final hours, according to both Carlotta and his physician, Dr. Harry Kozol, who were the only 2 people present, he grew lucid enough to speak once more, in a whisper. "I knew it," he said. "I knew it. Born in a hotel room, and goddammit, died in a hotel room." It was, by every account, the last thing he said. None of his 3 children were in that room. Eugene Jr. had been dead for 3 years. Shane had not spoken to his father in any meaningful way since the death of his infant son in the mid-1940s. Oona, 10 years unreconciled, and only months into a new exile of her own in Switzerland, was not present either, and there is no record of Eugene O'Neill attempting, even at the very end, to reach out to the daughter he had disowned a decade earlier. His will, finalized years before his death, left the overwhelming majority of his estate to Carlotta. His 2 surviving children, the ones who might reasonably have expected some share of a father's legacy, received, functionally, nothing. What he did leave behind, in a locked box rather than a will, was the manuscript of Long Day's Journey into Night, the play he had written in the early 1940s about his own family, his father's stinginess, his mother's morphine, his brother's slow ruin, and his own guilt at having, in his telling, been the cause of some of it. He had written explicit instructions that the play not be published or performed until 25 years after his death, a stipulation widely understood at the time as an act of mercy toward the people still living who would recognize themselves in it, however thinly disguised the names. Carlotta did not honor the instruction. Within 2 years of his death, she arranged for the play to be published, and it premiered on stage in Stockholm in February of 1956, less than 3 years after he had died, to overwhelming critical acclaim and a posthumous Pulitzer Prize, the 4th of his career. The timing carries its own quiet cruelty. The most honest, most devastating account Eugene O'Neill ever wrote of what his family had done to itself became a worldwide sensation, while 2 of his 3 children were still alive to watch it happen from the outside. A private catastrophe turned into a celebrated masterpiece years before its subjects had finished living out their own versions of it. Whether Oona, in Switzerland, ever sat through a performance of the play that had effectively been written about the household she'd grown up adjacent to and never fully inside of, is not something the historical record settles clearly. What is clear is that the year her father died was also the year that ended any possibility, however remote, that the estrangement might have resolved itself before it became permanent by default rather than by choice. She had spent a decade waiting for a phone call that was never going to come, and now there was no longer even a phone to answer at the other end. Chapter 9, 1977. By the mid-1970s, Charlie Chaplin was an old man in every sense, frail, mostly housebound at their estate above Lake Geneva, cared for by Oona and by the staff who had run the household for decades. But the decade also brought him something he had been denied for 20 years: formal, official rehabilitation. In 1972, he and Oona had returned briefly to the United States for an honorary Academy Award. Greeted with a 12-minute standing ovation from an industry that had effectively exiled him 2 decades earlier. In March of 1975, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him at Buckingham Palace, and Charlie Chaplin, stateless in practice for most of his adult life, became formally Sir Charles Chaplin. The exile that had defined the second half of his marriage to Oona was, by every visible measure, over. He had outlasted the men who had driven him out of America. He had been publicly forgiven by the country that had once refused to let him back in. He did not have long left to enjoy it. On the 22nd of June, 1977, Oona's brother Shane jumped from the 4th floor of an apartment building, thousands of miles away, ending a life that had been defined, almost from birth, by their father's absence, and had never found anything to replace it with. Oona was, by this point, decades and an ocean removed from the family she had grown up in, but the news reached her anyway, the way news of that kind always does. Whatever complicated mixture of grief, guilt, and long-buried resentment she carried toward the family she had left behind, Shane's death closed off, permanently, any possibility that the 3 O'Neill children might someday reconcile with one another the way none of them had ever managed to reconcile with their father. She had 6 months to absorb that loss before the second one arrived. Chaplin's health, already fragile, declined further through the autumn. On Christmas morning, the 25th of December, 1977, he died in his sleep at their home in Coursier-sur-Vevey, following a stroke at the age of 88. A small, private, Anglican funeral was held 2 days later in the local cemetery, attended by Oona, their children, and a small circle of close friends and staff. He was buried in the quiet Swiss village that had been their home for a quarter of a century, the place they had chosen not because they wanted to live there, but because the country Oona had grown up in, and the country Chaplin had spent most of his career in, had both, in their different ways, made it impossible for them to stay. In the space of a single calendar year, Oona O'Neill lost the brother who was her last living connection to the family that had shaped her childhood, and the husband who had spent 34 years standing in for the father who never spoke to her again. Both deaths arrived within 6 months of each other, on opposite sides of an ocean, closing out simultaneously the 2 relationships that had defined the entire arc of her adult life. She was 52 years old, and for the first time since she was 18, there was no O'Neill and no Chaplin left standing between her and whatever came next. What came next was not, by most accounts, recovery. Chapter 10. What was left. The strangeness was not quite finished. On the 1st of March, 1978, barely 2 months after Chaplin's funeral, the caretaker at the cemetery in Coursier-sur-Vevey discovered that the grave had been dug up and the coffin was gone. 2 men, a Polish refugee named Roman Wardas and a Bulgarian immigrant named Gansho Ganev, both struggling financially and both working as mechanics, had pried open the concrete slab in the dead of night and dragged the several hundred-pound oak coffin across the cemetery to a waiting van. They reburied it in a cornfield roughly a mile from the Chaplin family home and began calling Oona directly, demanding the equivalent of $600,000 for its return. Oona refused to pay. She told the press, when the story eventually broke, that her husband would have found the entire demand ridiculous, and she meant it as something closer to a description of his temperament than a boast. She played along with the negotiations at her lawyer's advice, mostly to help Swiss police trace the calls. And for 11 weeks, the authorities monitored roughly 200 phone booths across the region, while the men who had stolen Charlie Chaplin's body kept calling from a different one each time. They were finally arrested in mid-May, and, having apparently forgotten precisely where they had buried the coffin, led police on a search with metal detectors before the casket was recovered, undamaged, from the cornfield. Chaplin was reburied in the same cemetery, this time beneath a slab of reinforced concrete, designed to make a repeat attempt physically impossible. Oona, remarkably, eventually forgave the two men after receiving what she described as a genuinely remorseful letter, and did not pursue the maximum sentence available against them. It is difficult to imagine a stranger coda to a marriage that had already survived a government trying to exile the groom, and a father who never spoke to the bride again. But the body snatching, bizarre as it was, resolved itself within a season. What did not resolve was what came after it, once the police had gone, once the reburial was finished, once the cameras had moved on to the next story, and Oona was left alone in a house designed for a family of 10 that now held, most days, only her. She split her time in the years that followed between the manor in Switzerland and New York, where she attempted, by some accounts, to build something resembling an independent life for the first time since she was 17 years old. She formed a close relationship with the actor Ryan O'Neill, though she never remarried, and friends who saw her in this period described a woman who had once moved through every room she entered, with practiced composure now, withdrawing from most of them entirely. She became increasingly reclusive. She drank, by the accounts of people close to her, more and more heavily, the drinking accelerating rather than easing as the years passed. A decline biographers have generally traced directly back to the year that took her brother and her husband within 6 months of each other, and left her, for the first time in her adult life, without either of the two relationships that had organized everything else around them. She was a prolific diarist and letter writer for most of her life, the kind of habitual, private record-keeping that might, under different circumstances, have become the raw material for a memoir or a posthumous collection, much like the one her father had left behind in a locked box. In her will, she left explicit instructions of her own, that all of her writings be destroyed, unread and unpublished. Whether she was thinking specifically of what had happened to her father's papers, seized on by Carlotta and released to the world only 3 years after his death, instead of the 25 he had asked for, is not something any surviving record confirms. But the symmetry is hard to ignore. The daughter of a man whose most private confessions about his family were published against his stated wishes made certain, as her very last act of authorship, that the same thing would not happen to hers. Oona O'Neill died of pancreatic cancer on the 27th of September, 1991, in Corsia-Saveve, at the age of 66. She was buried beside Chaplin in the village cemetery, under the reinforced concrete that had been poured to protect him 13 years earlier, in the same small Swiss village that neither of them had chosen so much as ended up in, driven there by a father who would not forgive, and a country that would not forgive either. Chapter 11. What the Nobel Prize could not fix. There is a version of this story that ends with Eugene O'Neill as the villain and his 3 children as 3 interchangeable casualties of his failure to love them properly. It is not wrong, exactly, but it flattens something that becomes visible only once you look at all 3 of his children side by side, rather than one at a time. They did not respond to the same wound in the same way. Eugene Jr. tried to outachieve it, building an entire respectable identity in classics and radio and academic prestige, and the wound found him anyway, in a rented house in Woodstock, at 40. Shane never had the tools to outachieve anything, and the wound found him earliest and stayed longest, through combat trauma and heroin arrests, and a dead infant son, and a house stripped of its furniture, until he was 57. Oona did something neither of her brothers managed. She did not try to outachieve the wound, or absorb it in place. She left the country entirely, married a version of the attention her father had never given her, and built, for 3.5 decades, something that looked from the outside like the one branch of the family that had actually gotten away. It had not gotten away. It had only been given more time. When the two people standing between Oona and the original wound, her brother and her husband, both died within 6 months of each other in 1977. Whatever she had been holding at bay for 34 years arrived all at once. And the alcoholism and the isolation that took her over the following decade look, in retrospect, less like a new development than like a payment that had simply been deferred since 1943. 3 children. 3 different strategies for surviving a father who wrote more clearly about generational damage than any other American writer of his century, and still managed to inflict it on his own family with almost total precision. All 3 strategies failed in the end. They simply failed on different schedules. Eugene O'Neill spent his career trying to explain, through characters who were thinly disguised versions of his own parents and his own brother, exactly how a family destroys itself without any single member of it intending to. He understood the mechanism completely. He diagnosed it with a clarity that won him a Nobel Prize and 4 Pulitzers and a permanent place in the history of American drama. What he could never do, apparently, was interrupt the mechanism once it was running through his own hands, and by the time he tried to make some kind of peace with it, alone in a hotel room in Boston, with a locked box of manuscripts, and a wife who would defy his last wishes within 3 years of his death, it was far too late to reach the 2 children who were still alive to have used an apology. There is a small, deliberate act near the end of this story that I keep returning to. In 1986, Oona's daughter Geraldine had a daughter of her own and named her Oona after the grandmother who had, by then, spent most of her adult life in a kind of self-imposed exile from the very idea of family continuity. It was not a large gesture. It did not undo anything, but it meant that the name would keep being said out loud in that family, by choice, in a way it had almost stopped being said by her own father 40 years earlier. Somewhere in a village above Lake Geneva, under a slab of reinforced concrete, poured to keep grave robbers out, and a stack of private diaries that no one will ever read because their author asked that they be destroyed. That is most of what survives, in physical form. A grave that had to be protected. A silence that was chosen on purpose, this time instead of imposed. And a courthouse in Carpinteria, 60 years back down the road, where a father who had spent his whole life writing about the exact cost of a family's silence chose, when it was his own daughter standing at the altar, to add one more devastating page to the book he never got to finish living down.